In this module, or Chapter 4, we will be focusing on experiencing and expressing emotions. We know that emotions play an important role in everything we do when we're communicating. In this video, you are going to find that there are going to be moments of silence. That's because those moments of silence are meant for you to be able to read and focus and reflect on the particular items that are in your view. It is also important for you to pause the video at times, again, take notes, look back at what you're supposed to pull from the chapter, and think about how emotions connect to and differ from feelings and moods. The definition of emotion is quite complex, but I provided here for you. But one of the things we need to remember is that feelings and moods are different. Feelings are short-term emotional reactions with limited arousal, and they don't often have to require any kind of management. Moods are low intensity states that are not triggered by particular events and typically last longer than feelings or emotions. So really, feelings and moods are related to emotions, but emotions are the primary feature of both. There are 5 key features of emotions. First, emotion is reactive. It's something that occurs because something has triggered it. It's not often responsive, not something that we think about ahead of time because of the physiological arousal that we have. So emotion is reactive because it involves physiological arousal. Number 3, we experience emotion when we label it. We have to label it, whether we do it orally, aloud, or we do it inside our heads. But we have to label an emotion to help it come to life. Emotions are also constrained by historical, cultural, relational, and situational norms. Think back to how each of these previous chapters has focused on the importance of culture and gender and personality and family and context. Same thing goes for emotions. Lastly, you communicate emotion in a variety of ways. By the choices you make, by sharing your emotions, and sometimes through emotional contagion. Sometimes, for example, you might hear somebody laugh and then you start to laugh and then they laugh more and the laughter continues. But sometimes that can lead to physiological arousal in a sense of when you have teams that win a sporting event, for example, and you see people on the streets and they're so excited, but it's at such a high degree or intensity that the emotional contagion of that intensity is communicated to other people, and all of a sudden some of the fans might start actually going through and setting cars on fire, right, engaging in really poor social behavior, things that are against the law. So emotional contagions can be positive, but they can also lead to negative consequences. Take a moment to look at the 6 primary emotions. We often think of emotions as having hundreds and thousands of different types of emotions because our language is filled with words of intensity. But the 6 primary emotions for human beings are surprise, joy, disgust, anger, fear, and sadness. Then we can also experience blended or primary emotions. So we take these primary emotions of the 6 that we just mentioned, and you start to see things combined. Examples of blended emotions include jealousy, contempt, remorse, and awe. take a moment to think about which of those primary emotions feed into who you are, right? Some people might describe you as angry or fearful or sad, or somebody who surprises you. That's what they like about you. So think about the importance of how you express your emotions and how others perceive you expressing those emotions, and how that might influence how they choose to perceive you and how you then perceive yourself, going back to modules 2 and 3. Take some time to read through your textbook. If this happens to move too quickly, remember you can rewind it or pause it if you'd like. But think back to the importance of gender and culture in ways in which we shape or influence emotions. And the other influential component is personality, which goes back to last chapter's discussion of ocean. The three of the emotional or ocean traits influence emotion. They are agreeableness, extroversion, and neuroticism. Pause the video, take a closer read of that section in your textbook in Chapter 4. Since there are so many ways in which we have influences that might impact our emotions, one of the most important concepts that I hope you come away with from this course is emotional intelligence. Although many people call it EI, emotional intelligence, it's often referred to in the literature as EQ, your emotional quotient. Very similar to your overall intelligence, cognitive intelligence, for example, emotional intelligence is something that needs to be practiced. Not everybody can do it and do it effectively. You have to have an acute understanding of your own emotions. So you have to think about your emotions while they're happening. You have to be able to see things from other people's perspectives. Think back to empathy, right, in our previous chapters about who can empathize and how easy it is, and whether or not you are a good empathizer. We also have an aptitude for constructively managing your emotions. Not everybody can manage their emotions. Think about children. When they're younger, when they're toddlers, they can't control their emotions. Their emotions control them. Over time, they have to learn that they must not let their emotions rule their behaviors and their actions. And some people learn that, and some people do not. Fourth, the capacity or ability to harness your emotional states in productive and competent ways is another feature of emotional intelligence. But emotional intelligence doesn't end there either. It's also about how you can read others and how you might respond to others in interaction, which then makes you perhaps a better or more effective and ethical communicator. At this point, pause the video to take the self-quiz on emotional intelligence on page 103 in your textbook and reflect on where you are in your EQ. By now, you have taken your emotional intelligence quiz and have a better sense of you and your control and management of emotions. Two other things that we must consider after emotions are whether we suppress those emotions in future interactions and moments, or perhaps we might even vent, right? Allow them to emerge. So suppression is inhibiting your thoughts, your arousal, and outward displays of emotion. Maybe you know that it's wrong to have a particular emotion in certain venues. For example, you might actually express joy at a funeral in some very odd way. People will tell you that that's inappropriate. So you have to decide if in future funerals you're going to do the same thing. Most of the time, you're going to suppress that emotion. The other item that we can cover here is venting. This is where we allow our emotions to dominate our thoughts and explosively expressing them. We want to get those out. So, very often, for example, we don't like when people get angry, but anger can be very good. It can be cathartic and it can help you label and experience the anger for what it is. Now, others may not like to be on the receiving end of anger, right? And they may perceive you differently. But sometimes we do need to be angry. And we also sometimes need to be surprised for a long time that this is actually happening to you, whatever this is, right? So the emotion of joy can also be vented, right? It's about releasing it. It's allowing the emotion to dominate your thoughts and then giving yourself permission to express those emotions. Sometimes, in order to be more effective and ethical communicators, we have to be able to recognize the emotions before they occur. We might feel or anticipate. So think back to uncertainty avoidance, right? If you can't anticipate that it's going to happen, it's going to make it more difficult for you to think about those emotions before they occur and then how you want to manage them. So there are four different things to consider when thinking about controlling your emotions before they occur. The first one is an encounter avoidance. So if you know that seeing your cousin Joe really upsets you, then don't see Joe. Don't put yourself in places or remind or work with things or artifacts that will provoke your negative emotions about Joe. Right? Just because your family is meeting doesn't mean that you have to interact with Joe. Number two, encounter structuring. Try to avoid topics that may trigger negative emotions. I know for myself, I have friends who will say, well, I know we don't agree on this. So they're acknowledging up front that they want to avoid the topic. They're not looking for a fight, but they're trying to offer their opinion on something. And so I can either say, don't bring it up, let's not go there. Then why are you bringing it up? There's no sense in us discussing this. So avoiding topics that may trigger negative emotions is a good thing, right? If we can do that before we know that that is going to happen, that will benefit us and make our emotional experiences more positive. The third is attention focus. Intentionally devote your attention to certain aspects of an event or an encounter. So if you know you are going into a class that you really don't enjoy, maybe it's this one of the things you can do is decide, what are you going to focus on? Think about listening here. I'm sure at this point, none of you is saying, I can't wait to listen to that next video because I just love Karen's voice. I engage in aesthetic listening. No, but you can devote your attention to these videos by thinking about what you want to pull out of those videos, right? Your comprehensive types of listening. So attention focus is the third. The fourth is deactivation. When you try to systematically desensitize yourself to an emotional experience so that you don't feel anything in response to the triggers. So this is when, for example, maybe there's a particular celebrity that you don't like. I know, for example, people either really love the Kardashians or they don't, right? There's not a lot of people in the middle. So if you've decided that you're going to have to experience this with your friends, you might just desensitize yourself to that topic, not avoid it, but you decide you're not going to feel negative about it. So you want to deactivate the trigger before it begins. So think back to a very different experiences you've had with people where maybe you have a halo effect or a horn effect, and how using some of these strategies, if you will, can help you become more effective communicators and be more emotionally intelligent. In an earlier chapter, I spoke about how we need to have a reflexivity, not just a reflection, thinking about what we did, but thinking about what we're doing while we're doing it. And this particular moment of the chapter, the authors talk about reappraising emotions in the moment. This is them thinking about reflexivity. Now, I will be one to tell you right up front that I am certainly not an expert on doing this. Reappraisal is very difficult. It takes a lot of maturity, and I want to say emotional maturity, intelligence to control. It means actively changing how you think about the meaning of an emotion eliciting situation so that the emotional impact is changed. Now, I can do that sometimes, but I can't do it all the time. And sometimes I know that when I do it, I can do it well. And other times I know that it's going to be ineffective because I allow my thoughts to control my emotions. If you want to try to reappraise your emotion, it's often best to capture it at the onset, not a few minutes in or a few days in. 2 steps to think about. Call to mind the positive aspects of the encounter. So rather than focus on the negative, try to focus on the positive. I am terrible at this. This much I know. I can do it pretty well in the workplace, but with sibling relationships, it is very, very difficult for me. And then you can consider the short and long-term consequences of your actions in that encounter. So is it worth it in the long run? Or do you want to have some kind of short-term result or consequence that perhaps might be negative or positive depending on what your preference is? So remember that you can reappraise, but you have to be able to do it quickly. And I snapped my fingers then to say quickly. So keep in mind that emotional intelligence is not something that is easy. Again, I teach this stuff, and I'm not often good at some of the things that I can explain to you. We will all face and have faced emotional challenges. Let's look at some of the strategies we can use when talking about anger, for example. One of the things is we can suppress our anger. Now, that might cause us to hold things in a little bit too much and may cause some discomfort in our body physiologically. But if we suppress it, we know that we're suppressing it rather than trying to be chronically hostile or in a state of rage, if you will. Venting our anger can also be cathartic. It's expressive, right? It gets it out there. It doesn't mean people enjoy it. Maybe not the people that are receiving it. The people venting their anger often feel very good in the moment, but may think about it afterwards. But there's also this thing called the Jefferson strategy, going back to Thomas Jefferson, where you take a moment to count to 10 before you decide to respond. This means being highly aware of the trigger for the emotion. So the Jefferson strategy, you just count from 1 to 10 slowly, and then you respond because that gives you time to think about where you want to take this particular moment. The second is passion. Passion is a blended emotion driven by surprise. The actions or words deviate from the norm and passion lessens over time. So think about passion as something that is more short-lived, right? You might have a passion for the other person that you're with. And if you ask people that you know that have been married for a long time, their passion has changed over time. And in fact, if you're talking about romantic attraction related to passion, it often does disappear. Not completely, but it definitely lessens over time. And then there's grief. Intense sadness following a substantial loss. I'm sure each of us in this room has experienced that, whether it's been via a pet or another human being. Even sometimes we feel grief for people we don't know. Perhaps we're reading stories or seeing videos with people experiencing grief. When you're experiencing grief, you might want to try emotion sharing, letting other people know that you are grieving, because sharing that grief may actually allow you to feel connected to somebody else. So emotional challenges are there for us. And again, many of us are going to be good at this, but many of us are not. And sometimes we're really good at it in some relationships, but not in others. For example, I think I'm pretty good at anger management in my relationships at work and in my partner relationship. But with other siblings or in-laws, I may not have that. I may have to suppress at times things that I want to say. I may have to sometimes just vent and let it be cathartic, but oftentimes I end up going in with an apology, and some of you may do the same thing as well. The Jefferson strategy really does work. My mother, who is 80 years old, she drives still and she does very well. Don't let me figure that any differently. But one of the things she's noticed about herself is that she gets very upset with people who do the wrong thing. When they do the wrong thing, she finds herself getting immediately triggered by that event while driving. So she has learned to not close her eyes, thank goodness, while she's doing this, but to just pause for a moment in her breathing and count to 10 and do deep breaths. That strategy has helped her keep her emotions under control so that she doesn't get so caught up and distracted by the emotions herself. Remember that being an effective communicator means knowing how to engage others and when to engage others, especially when emotions are present. So, the first thing that you want to do in order to be supportive in your communication with others is to make sure that the person is ready to talk. Simply because you might have found that you might have been ready to talk in a situation doesn't mean others will be. So sometimes you can simply ask them, are you ready to talk? Because sometimes they need that provocation, if you will, to want to talk about the emotion they're sharing or their experience of that situation. But you can't just talk about it in passing, right? You have to find the right place and time because you want to be able to devote your attention, right? Perhaps to empathic listening during that time. Going back to our listening chapter. Ask good questions. If you suspect someone is thinking about suicide, and some of you may have experienced this, ask that person directly about it. Because if you just think they are and you don't mention it, you may not be able to save them. But if you suspect that someone is thinking about suicide, ask them, are you considering suicide? Because that'll allow you to make a better choice. Legitimize other people's emotions. If somebody says, I'm feeling depressed or I feel very angry about, don't say, well, you shouldn't feel that way. You can't tell somebody else. Well, let me take that back. You can tell somebody else you can't feel that way or you shouldn't feel that way, but it doesn't mean that those words are going to have any impact on those people. So legitimize, not minimize their emotions because they're experiencing those emotions then. Listen actively. Make sure that you are being an effective listener and thinking about how your perceptions of yourself and others may influence how you are being supportive. Offer advice cautiously. Sometimes people don't want advice, they just want to be able to vent, share their emotion with you. It doesn't mean they want a problem to be fixed. Show concern for the other person and give praise where praise is due. So being a supportive communicator also means being an ethical communicator. Don't fake this. If you fake it, it's only going to come back, as I say, to haunt you. right? Karma, baby. That's what I always say, karma. So think about ways in which you can be more supportive in some relationships or with some friends. But if you are not feeling like you're also getting a reciprocal type of supportive communication, then perhaps the relationship is something to be looked at in more depth. Think about the social penetration theory. Think about the Johari window. Think about the level of intimacy that you are sharing in this relationship.